And there she was, lounging in the shade of a bush, nibbling on a biscuit, when she heard an odd groan. She sat up, ears perked, and heard it again. It was faintly coming from inside the old forest, a creaking moan resonating from the dark depths. There the tree trunks were wider, more dense, and their tips just reached the lower branches of the taller, more slender trees that populated the hollow. The lower quarter of the trees were obscured by a thick blanket of brambles that matched the colors of the ashen wood and dark green leaves. No light came from the visible openings, and it seemed like none penetrated within. She took another bite of her biscuit, wrapped the rest in the handkerchief, and stuffed it into her pocket. At first, she hopped boldly from root to stone to root with a carefree air, but as she closed the distance to the first row of wide trunks, her timidity began to show. She paused after each hop, eyes and ears trained on the changing tree line, until cautiously approaching the edge of the brambles first. What might have been at least a head-high fence to an adult hobbit, or a waist-high inconvenience to one of the big folk, the height of the briars was over twice her own, obscuring the lower half of each gap between the fat trees. The perimeter was only as wide as she was tall, but was thickly woven together with no hole she could spot. She drew Ingal from its leather sheath and compared it to the width of the stems, which it turned out to be half of that of the sword. Now, Ingal was a bit pointy, though not by any means sharp, but it was carved from a lonely old oak Pa had found, finally felled by a fierce storm, and had proven to be solid enough to take on most grassy opponents. Turning to look back at the burrow for a moment, she faced the thicket and began swinging back and forth in a downward V motion. This did little to damage the stems, but knocked off many thorns that curved upwards. She did this to approximately 3 of her shoulder widths worth of the brambles, alternating swinging upwards and down. Then she began hacking at the bases of the now defenseless stems. She repeated this routine 3 more times, cursing herself for fatally testing her old staff on the river rocks, and whittled her way slowly through the barriers. She stopped only when about midway through the last line of briars in order to drink from her flask of water and finish the last of her biscuit. She attacked the final defenses with renewed fervor and was rewarded with a wall of roots as tall as her top curl of hair. She looked down the length both ways, confirming that it wouldn't do any good to make a hole anywhere else. Atehn would be forced to pull herself up just to see past the roots she had cleared a path to. She sheathed Ingal, noticing numerous stains, splinters, and fractures, which made her regret and cringe at the thought of having to risk using the sword again. With the rest of her gear secured to her body, she sprinted the short distance of her newly cleared path, leapt as high as she could with her arms outstretched, and grasped the root firmly at the top, pushing with her feet until she was splayed over it on her stomach. It wasn't until she was peering over and into the darkness that she realized not just the groaning had stopped. The whole forest had gone silent. Unnerved, she shrank back down as she allowed her eyes to adjust to the gloom. From somewhere within the labyrinthian biome came the echoes of the sing-song sound, and she immediately perked up. Her tiny heart pounded as she resolved herself and pulled the rest of the way over the wall-like root, sliding down the other side to the forest floor. She crept low, winding her way down the overlapping tendrils, finding that even in the larger spaces between the trees, there was very little earth available for other life. This did not seem to deter them from growing, though, as almost every patch had a variety of moss, fungus, and plants in various states of flourishing and decay. The rickety lullaby sounded a ways ahead of her for a few moments, and then again, everything went still. Standing up cautiously, she silently began lithely bounding across the root-covered ground. A staccato yawn-like bellowing sounded off to her left. She paused for a moment, then bounded after the sound. A few leaps and a skip or two further, and another call came from her right. This time she reacted more quickly, making twice the distance in half the time before the next forlorn cry echoed again from her right. She turned immediately, deftly kicking off of one of the roots, landing her in a crouch midst a crumbling dead fern that disintegrated with her impact. She smiled to herself, turning her head upwards, and to her perplexed wonder she saw that so little light broke through the canopy that it appeared like a shifting starry night sky. She was gazing at the twinkling pinpricks of sunlight when suddenly one of the sounds came from behind her, then another to her left, another behind her, and each time she turned, another sounded until, to her horror, she was no longer able to orient herself towards home, and there was no light in any direction. She was lost in an arborous maze at perpetual false midnight, that is, until the sun would go down, winking out the fake stars, the twisted branches likely too dense to make out the real ones. Her first response didn't help her situation, as she began madly dashing about, yelling, climbing over roots, and frantically peeking around trees. Her second response, attempting to climb, was also fruitless, because even with their shortened and stumpy stature, the limbs on these trees were still out of her reach. This was doubly frustrating because it was obvious that if she could just get onto one of them, navigating from tree to tree would be mostly effortless due to their closeness. Plus, she would most likely be able to see the taller trees near home from the tops of these. Ironically, it was her third response that ultimately proved to be the fruitful one, even though it was the one she thought was most pointless. She began to cry. It started as a low sob, 2 sniffles, a small cough, and then the dam broke. Tiny tears leaked down her face as a low wail escaped her lungs. She slumped to the ground and began clutching at a root about the size of her torso as the sadness and fear poured from her lips. Her little voice became beleaguered after a few moments, and she resigned simply to guttural moans with her eyes shut tightly to this nightmare. Suddenly her tummy rumbled, which startled her. Then again, except it was her whole body that shook this time. She sat up quickly, steadying herself on the dirt, and in addition to feeling the tremors again through the ground, she also heard the creaking groaning, the loudest she had heard it yet. It was coming from all around her. In fact, every root, trunk, limb, branch, twig, and leaf she could see was in motion. She gasped, which came out more like a little squeak, and she cowered down in the midst of the cacophony, covering her head, yet not taking her eyes off of the scene. Oddly, the trees seemed to sense her panic, and most of them stilled. Then, to her further amazement, the one she had been clutching began to lower a branch, slowly, all the way to the ground directly in front of her. She stared at it, then back up at the tree's trunk, cocking her head slightly, and then it clicked. These trees had been what had called to her, even if inadvertently. These trees, they could talk to one another. They could actually move. And one of them was inviting her to climb it. So, she did the opposite of what most terrified hobbits would do in such a situation, and stepped out onto the limb. She braced herself as it was slowly lifted up into the boughs, and once still again, she tested out tentatively with her toes. She had never been up this high before, and while it made her stomach do an odd jig, she was actually excited. First, she thought to be polite, and decided to go make a proper introduction. She climbed back the main branch until she settled up close to the trunk, some 20 paces off the ground, as a grown hobbit walks. She placed both palms against its smooth bark, and resting her forehead between them for a few moments, she smiled and softly said, "Thank you." The tree replied with a gentle shiver from its roots. Giving it a quick kiss, she walked back out on the branch and began making her way upwards towards the canopy. While going vertically was harder on her arms, she quickly began to trust her grip more than she would have previously. As the sunlight increased, she went faster, until, with a gasp, she breathed in the clean air while reluctantly closing her eyes to the brightness. Once her eyes had adjusted again, she found a perch and without much trouble spotted the tree line to the west. She double-checked her angle and made sure during the descent to keep herself oriented in that direction. Then, about midway through the boughs, she began scuttling across the limbs, tree to tree. Her feet picked up the rhythm as if she was hopping stones and roots on the ground, while her arms reflexively kept her steady, even braving the odd swing from one branch to another. The tree's reactions to her was peculiar, as they each quivered and creaked when she first touched them, but she would swear that it seemed they were shifting to make her crossing easier. She began hearing the groaning again, except now it was energetic rather than forlorn, and it was coming from the direction of the tree line. Atehn scurried through the treetops like an overgrown squirrel, which seemed to leave each tree in creaking laughter. Her own voice was high and exhilarated. Each daring leap, avoided misstep, last-minute save, bringing out her own squeaky giggles. She found herself looking out into the hollow that contained her home, feeling a bit of vertigo from the new vantage point. Even from the tops of these trees, she would be hard-pressed to make it in such a way, and through the taller ones as she had just done so. As if sensing this, the branch she stood on began lowering her to the ground. Before she stepped off, she stroked the branch softly as she whispered another thank you. Once she had dirt between her toes again, the tree recovered its limb into the others, while Atehn looked on in wonder. A final series of groans uttered from the shade as she turned back home. She suddenly realized she hadn't even been gone very long. The work to clear the briars had taken up the bulk of the time, while the flights into and from the forest had been relatively brief. It was barely midday, and Pa was due back this evening from a hunt, so she decided to go back and await his return. As she turned, striding back to the burrow, she didn't notice a slender face carefully peer out of the shadows, stopping just before the eyes as they reflected the glow of the sun. The grimy head tilted slowly downward, observing the obliterated remains of the thicket barrier. It lingered, pondering for a time, then raised its gaze in time to see the squeaky morsel being greeted by another, smaller delicacy. By the time Atehn picked up her sister Jabala and rounded the earthen corners of her home, the large gray fox had withdrawn into the forest, curling up near the tree line to sleep while awaiting the coming darkness.